Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all. My name is Carly Letts. I'm our Director of Community here at Learnit. Thank you for your patience this morning, working through a couple of technical things to start the new year, but we are live, and I'm super excited to kick off 2022 with all of you, and we're joined today by Terry McMahon, who is one of our amazing facilitators here at Learnit for design thinking. Before we jump into today's programming, I want to just give a little bit of an overview of how these community programs work and how they'll kind of work moving into 2022. So if you're not familiar with Learnit, we are a learning and development organization based out of San Francisco, California, but we train really globally, worldwide, to facilitate virtual training, really to help everyone upskill and learn the skills needed to thrive in the economy of today and our ever-changing world. And so our goal is to make our trainings and really learning accessible to everyone through these community events. So we host these Friday events every other Friday. Going into February, we'll be moving to a every other Friday cadence. And we also base our community events on a quarterly theme. So our theme for this month is all around designing your year. And as always, these sessions are led by incredible subject matter experts and guest speakers like Terry. So with that, I'm super excited to introduce all of you to Terry. Terry is one of our professional and development instructors and is a coach for us here at Learnit. Terry focuses on training really for growth and works with all levels of teams and executive teams to help employees and team members grow and learn new skills. And from attending Terry's class, she has a really authentic approach, a design-centered approach. So we're in really good hands as we learn today's session around design thinking. So with that, I want to welcome Terry, and I'll cue up our slides. So welcome, Terry. Thank you so much for being here.
You bet. It's great to be here. Lovely, lovely. Design thinking. It's one of my favorite subjects. As we get into this, I want to start with a story. I'm going to start with this story. And this has to do with a company called General Mills. General Mills is in the Midwest America, and it introduced cake mixes to their audiences a while ago, homemakers at the time. And at that time, the idea failed. It was a prepackaged product. It was easily mixed with water. You've probably maybe even created a cake through a cake mix yourself. Goes into the oven. Everyone agreed that it tasted great, but cake mixes at that time, they just tanked. Just the idea tanked. People agreed that the innovation was delicious, but there was a psychological barrier to the cake mixes. The act of making a cake is equated with care. Making a cake for your family or a birthday or a cake walk contest for your kid's school or something, that's a representation of care. And this prepackaged experience was a violation of care. So when the company General Mills figured out the psychological care aspect and took out, believe it or not, the powdered eggs, telling their customers that, not only did you need to mix water, but you had to mix your own fresh eggs in it, then the cake mixes took off. Fresh eggs. I care more when I put in my own fresh eggs. This is a core component of innovation, seeing things from the perspective of others, which I'll talk about quite a bit today. I would say that many organizations in their crowded markets, they fight to up their presence, and they look mainly at maybe these three things, like making better products, magnifying their marketing. All these things make sense. Hiring better for the customer experience. These are all well-intentioned practices to move the needle forward, but looking at the things that hold their customers back, that can lead to greater success. And that's where design thinking comes in. I think we would rather build a bigger rocket than make a lighter spaceship. We often assume if an idea or a product is not working, that it lacks appeal. And then we focus on elevating the appeal to motivate and woo. We load it with more fuel, right? Carrots, sticks, marketing, whatever. Building a bigger rocket is sexier than the humbling experience of maybe exploring materials that make it a lighter spaceship. So, the bigger problem, I think, many times is it's easier to face that myriad of smaller reasons or frictions. But friction really requires discovery. It requires you to be thinking about the other. So, we're thinking about a shift in our attention from the idea itself to this natural point of fixation and start to consider the audience. That's where design thinking can get you to that human centered approach, which puts your audience first, if that makes sense. All right. Great. Carly, let's move over to how about slide 4? Let's look at slide 4. As you can see, prolonged global trauma event, COVID, we're all in it. It has forced us to change things. It's forced us to adapt. It's forced us to innovate. What we've had to do things differently. Carly, you tell me if this is a good idea. Can we bring up the chat? And if people would just like to share in the chat, if you had plans on hold, if you had to throw them away, if you had to come up with new ones, if you found yourself scrambling to do, rapid problem solving or solving for new approaches. In the chat, can you just put in a few words what you did to maintain your job, your company, your life, your spirit, your health because of this prolonged global trauma? And Carly, just tell me if there's anything that you're finding in the chat. And if not, I can move on. But I do imagine that there was a lot of like, we've never done this before. In some companies, maybe there'd been a lot of planning for this kind of thing. You never wanted it to happen. And then now you get to practice, right? This will never happen, but yet here we are. It's forced us to innovate. So, Carly, anything constant change to survive? Yeah, lots of stuff going on. People had to look at doing things a different way, doing things a way. And I know managers and leaders always like to know what's next, and you didn't know what's next. So you probably had to say, I don't know what's next. And that's a hard thing to say as a leader. All right. But let me move on. Remember Charles Darwin? What was Darwin famous for? The theory of evolution, yeah. Survival of the fittest, yeah. Actually, what he said, and we can move on to the next slide, is it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but rather the ones that are most responsive to change. Most responsive to change. It's survival of the most adaptable. And so we've had to adapt. And within that adaptation spawned by COVID, we have had to be more innovative. We've just had to be more innovative. So if you can think about Charles Darwin, think about not just survival of the fittest, but how can I be flexible? How can I be adaptive? And I think that's where design thinking takes us also. Great. And looking at the next slide, I think this is one of my favorites. I really like to talk about innovators that have been in our cultural and political arena, especially prominent millennials. And here you see Detroit, Michigan, in what's called the Rust Belt of America. It suffered great hardship, deindustrialization in the 80s, the 90s, beginning of the 21st century. Factories closed. Industries that have been around for generations, they collapsed. These are pictures right here of young Black Detroiters who chose to stay in their majority African American city, or they have returned from other places to take part in revitalization efforts. They're starting new businesses. They're educating the generation following them. They're participating in the vibrant art scene and drinking the pour over coffees. And I mention them because they have innovated through economic, cultural comebacks to their distressed American city. All right. And then you'll also see, this is somebody you may be familiar with, Malala Yousafzai. She's a Pakistani activist. Her subject is female education. She won the Nobel Peace Prize. She's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. She's also the world's youngest Nobel Prize laureate and the second Pakistani. She's known for human rights advocacy. Again, especially the education of women and children in her native Swat Valley in Northwest Pakistan. And her advocacy has grown into this international movement. So again, these are a few prominent millennial innovators that I wanted to point out. But let's look at the next slide. What is innovation? If you look up innovation in the dictionary, this might be what you'll find. There's lots of different definitions, but it's a new idea. It's a new device. It's a method. It's the act or process of introducing new ideas. There are many definitions. Here's one I like. This is the next slide. Innovation is the process of creating value by applying novel solutions to meaningful problems. And the reason I believe this definition is useful is that there are those three explicit tests for innovativeness right there in the definition. Is it novel? Is it novel? That notion of novelty is baked right into the word innovation. If it's not new, it's probably more optimization than innovation. We're not just generating an old thing, but what is truly new, what is truly different. That's what we're trying to do. Does it solve a meaningful problem? If not, maybe it's art instead of innovation. And that's not to say that art isn't valuable, but it's generally not designed to solve a problem. Innovation is. And then does it create value? If not, maybe it's an invention rather than innovation. Inventions can lead to valuable creation, but usually not until someone applies that invention through innovation. Like, I've got a problem. What do I need? I got to invent something, but I got to figure out what the problem is first. What's the value that we're creating for our teams, for our customers, for our business units, for our countries? All right. So let's look at the next slide. Why innovate? I'll walk out some ideas, but I want you to think about in terms of your life or your business problem or your professional world. All right. First thing that comes to mind, why innovate, is to bring forward a unique product. I'd also love people in the chat to just respond to, like, why should we innovate? What's the big deal about innovating? What's going to help us when we innovate? Company A doesn't provide as much value if they're just providing the same thing as company B as the same price. So we're trying to secure a position in the marketplace. All right. But why else should we innovate? Why else? Anybody have anything? To stay in competition? Absolutely. Everything is always changing. It's changing around us. So, we have to stay ahead. The first reason for innovation is relevancy. If you don't innovate, if you don't come up with truly novel solutions that have value, then you're not relevant anymore. You go by the wayside. Great. Anything else? Think outside the box and create new things. Absolutely. What else could I think of that somebody might need that maybe they don't even know that they want or need, or that will provide them with a solution to a problem that has been deeply buried, and now I've come up with what that solution is. Think outside the box. I love that. The number two reason, I think, also is survival. You got to survive. You don't innovate, you don't survive because somebody is out there right now working on building a bigger, better mousetrap than you are. You are probably amazing at what you do, but are you the only people who do what you do? Probably not. No doubt you have competitors. So I think those are the two biggest reasons for innovation. Yared also said you have to innovate, yes, to survive. If you don't innovate, your product will eventually be overtaken. Absolutely. There are other reasons to innovate, but I think those are the two biggest: relevancy and survival. All right. Let's look at slide 12, Carly. Bring up slide 12. This is about prioritizing what is going on in the innovation. That is the key to unlocking this post-crisis growth, or this big crisis growth, because we've had this pandemic. All right. So I want to ask you, what's your biggest business challenge or problem? In the chat, one or two words, if you're willing to share, answer that question. What is your biggest business problem or challenge? What do you think? Meeting unpredicted new needs. Absolutely, Reem. Absolutely. It's so hard to predict what's going on there. Supply chain. Absolutely. Supply chain. That is holding a lot of people up. If you live in a city where you've got like massive traffic jams, I'm going to give you a little story here. Too much competition, selling the same products, absolutely. Let's talk about a little story here. You can think of San Francisco, you can think of London, you can think of LA. Let's say we've identified that there's a massive traffic jam in an area where there's just a 2-lane highway, 1 lane on each side. Okay, well then, all right, let's expand it to 2 lanes. Let's give it more resources. What happens now? You have more resources. You needed more resources, perhaps. Yeah, let's just make it bigger. But then you've got more traffic. Sometimes adding more isn't necessarily a good thing because it just attracts more of what you had originally. So the point here, and we're going to spend a little time here, is coming down to the proper problem definition of what's happening. You might define the problem as, all right, maybe we need more roads. Or is there a different definition? Maybe it's not that we need more lanes. Is the problem too many cars? Or what's the reason why the cars are on the road in the first place? Or perhaps it's too many cars on the road at the same time. Now maybe we're getting more to what the problem is. Then you have to ask, why are all these cars on the road at the same time? It's because we're all trying to get to work. So now we might be getting somewhere. Do we need to get to work all at the same time? For most of us, the answer now I think is no, because you've been doing work from home for a year and a half now, many of us. Yes, there's some essential jobs you actually have to go to be in person for, but you could be rethinking this because you're defining the problem and you're going further in. Let's not just throw resources at it because it could just make the problem bigger. We're not really solving the problem, but how could we solve the problem? COVID, I think, has really forced us to rethink business models. Businesses that have not been able to adapt, I think, have gone out of business. Okay. So let's look at slide 14 because I want to talk about what is creativity. We'll go back from the Albert Einstein and we'll look at what is creativity. What is creativity? Because this is going to get us somewhere in this design thinking. I'm going to ask you to open up the chat. Would you please come up with as many ways as possible in the chat that you can think of for using a paperclip? As many ways as possible for using a paperclip. Imagine a paperclip. Think of how many different ways you can use that paperclip. Offer your ideas in the chat. Let me know what you can use a paperclip for and use the chat. We probably know the obvious things that we can use a paperclip for, but what can we use? Yeah, lockpick. Absolutely. Lockpick. Good. Some people, I think, have fixed their smartphones with a paperclip. Clean my ear. Thank you, Jim. Yes, some people clean my ear. Great. Hair tie, twist tie. Absolutely. Reset the router. Yes, it's been done before in my household. Make a chain. Yeah, make a chain, make jewelry. What else can you do with a paperclip? Opening the SIM tray of a smartphone. Yeah, yeah. As an electrical conductor in a pinch when the wire is not available. Great, good. If you know how to do that, more power to you. I love that, Melissa. Hanging tree ornaments. Yes, yes. This happened when I came back to my house this year and I thought, oh, we're trimming the tree and I couldn't find any of those hanging ornament wires. Phone stand. Good, Dambrose. I just love that phone stand. Hold papers together. Yes, and the obvious hold papers together. Good. So you came up with all of these and even more in just a span of a couple minutes, of a few seconds, actually. All of these different ways of using a very simple device, a paperclip. And if you can come up with this creativity, right, in a short amount of time with a paperclip, what could you bring to solve other issues simply by activating creativity instead of, finding yourself nullified by being in the problem? Can you bring that similar creativity to these issues? Let's look at that Einstein quote now. Einstein says, we can't solve our problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. We need to be innovative. We need to not fall into that fixed mindset that might have gotten us into the problem. Many times when we've got to be thinking completely away from the box. So that brings us to a set of tools called design thinking. Our next slide. What is design thinking? It's not some crazy fad. It's not the next hot business fad that's going to go away. Design thinking, people use this every day. What it is, it's a process. It's a set of tools designed to help you be innovative. It comes up with innovative solutions to problems or challenges rather than get in the room and say, I don't know, what do you think? I don't know, what do you think? My uncle's got a barn and we could make costumes. How do we do this in a structured way? A process. That's what it is, a process. Good. So let's look at slide 18 and the core principles of design thinking. Slide 18, the core principles of design thinking. Number one, you have to focus on the customer. This has to be human-centric. You must look at who is experiencing the problem, who is most affected by the problem or the challenge, and where is their pain? What are they going through? How does it affect them? You have to spend time, many times, talking to them and figure out just what is the extent of the problem. Here's another story. This time, this is about a nonprofit that I heard about. A shelter for women and children who are experiencing domestic abuse and homelessness. And this shelter found out that their customers were coming to their building, their agency, looking at their entrance for minutes or even hours, and then turning away. What was happening? This agency called Shade Tree had a sign not only that said welcome, but in their front window, they had a sign that said, no pets allowed. If you may be in a difficult relationship, leaving your circumstances, that might be clear. However, the psychological mindset of leaving a pet behind, that might be the deal breaker. And that's what this agency finally realized, that was the big setback. And so what they did when they figured out, the problem has to do with these humans that are coming into our agency, and that's what's holding them back, they opened an animal shelter for their clients' pets close by. If you don't study what's holding people back, it can seem like there's some kind of invisible force that's demotivating them and keeping them from action. Good. Number two on this slide, you show, you don't tell. At many points in the design thinking process, you need to go from talking to action. And sometimes that could be very difficult. You have to show and not tell. Then you have to go to number three, the next piece, and that's you need to experiment. You need to take those ideas that you have and you have to figure out, how do I experiment? So once you think about what the problem is and then you come up with some brainstorm solutions, you experiment, you prototype. And then the last one is you test. You test by the power of iteration and you keep retesting till you figure out that that's the solution. And then you go with that to start with. So 4 principles of design thinking underneath the actual steps. The process tool is intended to help us avoid cognitive biases, which I'm going to talk about for just a minute. Cognitive biases are reactions based on learnings that we've had from before. Great. They may become our default reactions. Many of you know people that seem to be, stuck in a certain way of thinking. They're not really open to new ideas or new ways of doing things. My favorite quote from one participant from this work said, interacting with these kinds of people can be like being in a round room with no windows. All right, so take a look at some of these ideas that happen for us when we're thinking about the cognitive biases. What happens? We focus on the process instead of the solution. That's what we want to do with design thinking. Design thinking focuses on the customer as a human, which I talked about before, focusing on brainstorming and letting go of preconceived notions. It's always this way. It's always that way. Focusing on a hands-on approach, we actually have to get up and experiment, prototype, and test. Great. So design thinking, the process. Let's go straight to what is it? Here's the actual process. Next slide. As I walk through this, you might want to jot down somewhere if you think you do enough of each of these steps. First, what you want to do is you want to empathize. The way you do that is you put yourself in the other person's shoes. You find a way to be curious. You interview, you observe. What is it that's going on with that thing or that event that needs to be solved? The second thing, is define the problem. This is one that we've already noted, but one of the most difficult. And I'll give you a couple things to help unlock that, but I want to go through the whole process first. Like the traffic problem. Is it about there's not enough lanes or resources, or is it something else? Because then just more traffic springs up if you put up more lanes. Defining is the place that we skip over a lot. What's the actual problem? And we can find a definition for that. A lot of times we assume we know. That's again cognitive traps. We get assumptive. Yeah, we know what it is. We can feel it. But can you write it down? Can you name it? Can you actually articulate it? Right? How many of you have probably been in meetings where you jumped to what you thought the problem was, you started maybe brainstorming, what are the solutions? And then later on you figured out, we actually solved for the wrong problem, or the problem we thought we were solving for is still there. We didn't understand the problem really. We often rush this critical step, and this is the step that you got to get right. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time, money, resources, and energy towards something that may not bear the fruit of what you want. Great. The third one, ideate. And this is where that creativity of the paperclip comes in. This is where you get to bring the kids into the room, not just the parents. In fact, you don't want the parents. You want lots of ideas. You want, and I'll talk about it later, you want even the bad ideas because those can lend to inspiration. You want to promote everything as a yes because something could lead to something extraordinary that seems implausible, simple to begin with. But you don't know until you go in and you ideate. All right. The next one is prototype. This is where you get to pick and choose. This is where you're actually, yeah, all right, let's bring the adults back in. Let's sift, let's shift. Let's figure out which one of these would be the best one to test, which will be the best one for us to surface that we want to engage in. And sometimes if you come up with 1, 2, 3 ideas and they all sound equally wonderful, what do you do in that case? Well, test them all, take it further. Testing is the last thing, or test each one if you've got multiples in a limited scale, limited duration. Give several in the sandbox a small scale tryout. See what surfaces. So maybe it's like number 2, the best idea, or maybe it's elements of 1, 2, and 3, but you wouldn't know unless you went, you know what, we really need to look at several things here. Okay, several things here. Let's look at the define phase. Let's talk about that define phase. The next slide, because that can, again, what usually happens in organizations or in teams is you think you know what the problem is. You might talk to 1 or 2 people. Oh, yeah, I get it. Yeah. Okay, boom. And then for some, that ego kicks in. Again, maybe even that bias, and you immediately jump over to, let's look at the next slide. You see how you can jump over and not figure out what the problem is. You go, yep, I'm empathizing. I got what it is. And I'm going straight to prototyping. And then I have to go back to ideating. And then maybe I go to testing. And then I haven't really defined the problem. So I got to go all the way back to defining the problem. So if you go and put a solution in place, but you realize, oh, wait a minute, maybe we need to come back to that, define the problem, and give some other people some fresh chances and come up with new ideas. Think about if that's ever happened with your, yeah, we've got a problem, but we jump straight to prototyping. Okay. I want to give you a couple of tools. And if you take our full class, I'd probably give you more tools, but let me just give you a couple. We'll go to the 5 whys. I love this tool. And this goes back to the defining. You may feel like, oh, I want to jump into ideating. I want to jump into prototyping. But think about if you've asked enough whys. Here's one tool to help you figure out problems and challenges. It's called the 5 whys. If you have kids, you know this one? Your kids at a certain age may ask you incessantly, why is the sky blue? Why does the dog have a tail? Why do I have to wear clothes? Why do I have to brush my teeth? Why does night come before I want it to come? It's a tool to help you really more deeply understand your customers, really to the point of empathy. It's trying to figure out what's going on for them. So the idea is to ask why 5 times, maybe it's 3 times, but more than 3 times at least to get clarity, or maybe even get closer, or even the answer. I'm going to take you through a little the robot stopped working scenario, which is our next slide, to present what it looks like to do the 5 whys. Here's the situation. The robot stopped working. We're in a robot manufacturing area and the robot stopped working. What do we do? What do we do? We find out why it stopped working. And that's the first thing we're going to ask. Why did the robot stop working? Somebody who works with a robot says, the circuit overloaded. A fuse blew. Okay, so we've blown a fuse. So what do we do? Right? Many of you might say, let's replace the fuse. Great. This is the thinking. But I would also say this is the hamster wheel thinking. What happens if you don't understand the reason they blew a fuse in the first place? You replace it and you just wind up blowing 4 or 5 more fuses. So what's the real next question? Let's look at the next question. Why did the fuse blow? Why did the circuit overload? Because there was insufficient lubrication on the bearings. That's the answer. So they locked up, causing the circuit to overload, causing the fuse to blow. What do we do? What's the next question? Yeah, it can be kind of obvious. Why was there insufficient lubrication? Because the oil pump on the robot is not circulating sufficient oil. Well, why is that? Why is it not circulating sufficient oil? Because the pump intake is clogged with metal shavings. Why is that? We just have to keep going because there's no filter on the pump. Ba-ding! Why is there no filter on the pump? Because maybe Bob, who's in charge of maintaining the robot, didn't end up putting a filter on there. Maybe that's it. Well, why didn't Bob put a filter on there? Because he didn't have filters. Why? Because we didn't get a purchase order for the filter. All right. You might stop there, but maybe with Bob, it's a training issue. Why did the fuse blow? Maybe it's a training issue with Bob. But what I'm trying to say is if we don't ask those whys, if we don't look at what's next, we probably would never get, oh, there is no filter. And we would have gone back to fuses, just fuses. Let's go to another, let's go to slide, I have 28 here, called Q storming. Q storming. All right. Let's look at that one. Great. Here's a great tool. A lot of times, if you've engaged in brainstorming activities for problem solving, you've probably maybe sat in a room and just started populating a board with ideas. And many times you get mired down in discussing each of the ideas, and you don't really get to the entire logical or creative process to find out what's necessary. You get sidetracked again in solving things. Also, people don't process at the same rate. Some people are quick thinkers. Some people need time to chew on ideas. Those folks might feel like they're getting stepped on by the fast processors because we're already into solving the problem. Group think can also be a problem because whoever is the alpha in the room may take over, or you might let somebody take over. It's like, well, whatever Diane thinks because she's got great ideas. Then you just go with that idea. And it might not be a bad idea, but many times it's your first idea or somebody else's idea, and you're not really asking questions. So Q storming really is just that. It's before ideation. It's a process specifically designed to help you get to the root of your problem again. And what you do is you just ask a lot of questions, lots of questions. You storm the idea by coming up with questions. You don't even answer the questions. And that's where you get stuck many times because you want to start answering the questions and coming up with ideas. Don't do it. Don't do it. All right? Don't do it. If we could answer that would that actually define the problem? Well, maybe not yet. So let's take a simple problem, and I want you to bring up the chat, like what to have for dinner or where to go on vacation. All right. Let's say Carly is going to go on vacation. What are the questions that you might want to pose to Carly in the chat that she might want to ask herself before she goes on vacation to find the best place to go on vacation? Bring up the chat, and what are some of the things that you would ask before you even come up with, let's go to Hawaii, let's go to Tennessee, let's go to New York, let's go to the Grand Canyon. Bring up the chat, and what are some of the questions that you might ask Charlie? What's your budget? Absolutely. What's Carly's budget to be able to go on vacation? What else might you ask? What type of weather is important to you? Exactly. Are you a skier? Are you looking for sun? What else might you ask? Q storm Carly's vacation. What amuses you the most? Great. Are you somebody that's into an amusement park? Are you somebody that's like, that's the last place that I would go for my vacation? How do you want to spend the time during vacation? Right? Do you want to rest? Do you want to explore? Do you want to eat? Do you want to learn something? Do you want to meet people? What type of foods does she like? Absolutely. Great. This is Q storming. How long can the vacation last? Great. Is it a month? Am I just looking for 36 hours? Is it going to be 24 hours and it needs to be a staycation? Are you going alone or with family? Beautiful. Thank you so much. That is Q storming Carly's vacation. All right. Nice. Let's look at, I want to talk a little bit more about cognitive traps. All right. So I'm looking at slide 29. What gets in the way of our doing this? Again, even employing things like the 5 whys or Q storming are cognitive traps. You find yourself going back to your own processes. Yes, they all have a place. Same with these tools. Sometimes you go to the whys and maybe it doesn't feel like the right question. Sometimes you got to pop over to Q storming. But we have to have freedom when we ask different kinds of questions and go to parts of the problem that we don't think about if we can avoid our cognitive biases. So try to figure out which tools you want to use. And again, our regular class has even more of them. Use them all. They're not mutually exclusive. Take a look at what Dan Ariely, he's a professor of psychology and behavioral economics at Duke University, says. He says we're not only irrational, but we are predictably irrational. We're flawed. We're human beings. We are predictably irrational. We think we're logical, making sound, logical, rational decisions, but we're not. We're emotional. Okay. That limbic area, the emotional part of our brain, processes all the information first because we're checking around to see if we're going to be eaten by bears. And then when the processors realize, there's no direct threat, then we kick up to that logical place. But if we're ticked off, if we're emotional, if we're stressed out, which we all are at all many times in our life, then we're not always thinking with our best minds. Let's look at the next idea, thinking fast and thinking slow. We tend to think fast because we're on that hamster wheel trying to come up with fast solutions. The problem with fast thinking is that you might not think of everything like we talked about before. You're thinking too quickly. You jump to conclusions, and fast thinking is automatic, it's instinctual, it's emotional, and it's biased based. Great. Slow thinking is process based, it's focused, it's deliberate. That's what we just did with the vacation exercise, deliberate process based thinking. These processes of using a tool or a structure, it doesn't take that long. You can set a time limit. Great, 5 minutes, we're going to do Q storming or ask why continually. It doesn't have to take forever. You just have to be okay with trusting a process, a structure, and getting out of this fast thinking. All right. Let's go to slide 33 because I just want to identify some of these cognitive biases that become our traps. Here are 3 kind of constellations of biases. Self-interest, that's when you're biased toward things that you really care about, and there's lots of little biases underneath that. Immediacy biases, that's like the bias to only look at the immediate threat and give yourself rewards to survive in the present moment. And then stability biases. These are you're biased toward things that make you stay in the moment, that don't rock the boat. All right, next slide. The top 3 biases that come up most often, these are specific biases that come from that constellations that we just talked about, are affinity. That's when you tend to go along with the ideas from people that are like you, think like you, act like you, look like you, or even people that you like. All right, confirmation bias. And I think this is a big one. You already believe X, so you will only accept information that confirms what you already believe. And if you hear information that counters that, then you discount it. Yeah, the sky is purple. Well, how do you know? I just know. I don't need to look up. I just know. And then the last one is status quo bias. That's the way it is. Great. That's the way we've always done it. That's the way it always works. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Those are ones that you need to stay away. If you took the long class, we would talk more about how you can debias those things and some strategies. But I want to jump to slide 36, which is decision making. There's a rule of 3 in decision making. If you only have one idea as a solution for your problem, it's probably a bias. How do I know I'm biased? I came up with one idea. It's probably a bias. 2 ideas, it's probably an argument. You and somebody else. 3 ideas, 3 or more ideas, now you're in the realm of brainstorm. And that's why it's important to solicit diverse ideas. So if you click through there, Carly, you can see that this is what happens when you've got maybe just 3 ideas. All right. I want to jump to slide 40. Another way of thinking about creativity once you finally get there is everything in the world is made up. All your processes, all your systems, your jobs, it's made up by a person or a group of people. So if what that's been made up isn't working, you get to make up something else because everything in life is made up. All right. Yes, it will cost time, money, energy, but it's better than, if it's better than what you've got, put the time, money, energy into it. Do some design thinking. And let's look at the next slide. Here's one thing to look for. What's the worst possible idea? This is another tool. Actually going in, not what's the best idea, what's the worst idea? Because usually when we're trying to solve a problem, we want to come up with the best idea. Another brainstorming tool is what's the worst idea? And maybe some of you have seen the worst idea actually become the right idea. Pet rock craze. You put rocks in a box with air holes. That was a bad idea that made millions of dollars. Mood rings. Bad idea, made millions of dollars. What if we sold books online? What if we sold everything online? Amazon. Would people really buy stuff without going into a store and seeing it first? Yes, that's what's happened. So another tool is engage people in a short brainstorming session about what's the worst idea that they could come up with. And if we go to the next slide, this is what the worst idea can get you. List terrible, horrible, no good, very bad ideas. Dissect one really awful, bad idea and what good idea can come out of that bad idea. I'll give you an example. A group of oil pipeline workers were sitting around brainstorming, trying to figure out how to identify underwater gas leaks, something like that. And somebody had a great idea. Wouldn't it be great if we could just get the fish to do it for us, to tell us that there's a leak? Well, that's a bad idea, of course. But someone took that idea and said, we do have underwater gas sensors. And what if we attached it to a dolphin? Well, we can't do that. But what if we attached the sensor to a robot? Now we have an underwater robot gas sensor. And that came from that seemingly silly and impossible fish idea. All right. Let's look at slide 45, and I just want to end with a quick review of our design thinking cadence. Just think about empathize, define the problem, ideate and brainstorm, choose a prototype and test. This cadence can jump around. The first pass through, you might want to go in that order. But what I want you to do is I want you to think of which of these steps, and you can put it in the chat, are you most interested in harnessing for your work? All of them, some of them, others, put it in the chat. Is there an idea in this cadence that you would walk out now that you've learned the basic idea of design thinking? Where is it that you want to make more time for? Is it defining the problem? Is it actually ideating and you're not bringing the adults into the room? Define. Yeah, Mohammed, absolutely. Prototype and test. Good. Sophonius, I love that. Yeah, because maybe you're not spending enough time there. Maybe you're actually going straight to solution, 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 and you're not really testing things. You're not really looking at what's the best prototype. Ideate. Yeah. If you're in a place where it's sensitive to be creative, right? You're mostly dealing with data. You're not allowing for creativity. Then you want to ideate. Yeah, Karen, that's great. Embrace failure, Mohammed. Absolutely. Worst idea. Absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you so much for just some of these first ideas about design thinking and coming to our offsite. Carly, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Terry, thank you so much. Everyone in the chat, if you enjoyed today's session, just give us a little bit of love in the chat, maybe a thumbs up, maybe a little applause. Terry, I really want to thank you. And perfect example of kind of being ideating was just even being flexible in how we facilitated today's session. So I want to thank you for being adaptable. I want to thank everyone for being here in the chat with us. And also just a couple ways to dive deeper with us. I'll go ahead and share my screen once again. But one of the ways that you can continue to engage with us, of course, as we talked about, we have free programming every week. And one of the best ways to dive deeper with us is by joining our free community called Offsite. So thank you to those of you who are already joining us in Offsite and engaging with the community. We have a network of 5,000 plus professionals from all over the world. And not only do you get kind of more exclusive access to these events, but there's also access to today's recording, the presentation and slide deck. There's Ask the Expert sessions, so you can come and kind of do open office hours with our experts like Terry to ask your specific questions. And we also offer badges of certification in the specific competencies that we facilitate and teach here at Learnit. So there's a QR code, but we'll also put the link to join Offsite in the chat. And I will also share that via email with all of you after this session. But really want to thank all of you for your time. And we look forward to seeing you in Offsite and hopefully in a class soon. So thank you so much, everyone.